Thanks for putting us on. Our paper is called Central Bank Balance Sheets and Financial Crises. It's a long-run perspective, 1587 to 2020. And this is joint work with Neil, Martin, and Paul, with whom we have not only put down together this paper. With Neil, I had some earlier work on this done for this ECB Sintra conference a while ago. So that continues that line of research. What we do here, what we're motivated by is pretty much Enrico summed it up. The central bank balance sheet have become an important part of the policy toolbox, one that is, has been sort of the go-to instrument for many in crises and for many problems in the economy. But we know very little about the history, the uses, and the effects of this of the balance sheet tool. So central banks using their balance sheet as a instrument of policy, of financial stability policy, of monetary policy. What we do is in characteristic fashion, we're going to take a long-run historical perspective and study the balance sheet tool sort of at the source for the first time. What we do is we've assembled a new data set for central bank balance sheets, basically in all advanced economies since the 1600s, and we'll study the relationship of balance sheets to the macroeconomy. Over that period, we're going to unlock a wealth of historical event studies when central banks use their balance sheet for different purposes. I'm going to talk about that in greater detail. And for those of you who wake up in the morning and worry about identification, we're going to study the causal effects of lender of last resort operations using a novel IB strategy that exploits, using a long-run data set, that exploits plausibly exogenous variation in liquidity support during crisis time. So I think that's the first, and it connects very nicely with what Enrico just said. And we know relatively little about what these this go-to, the sort of first aid that central banks provide these days to economies and financial sectors. We study the effects of that in history. What we find, and that's the sneak preview, is that balance sheets have indeed reached, central bank balance sheets have indeed reached unprecedented size relative to GDP, but not relative to government debt levels or financial sector size. So I think that's an important qualification also for current debates about fiscal dominance. We're still far away from classic debt monetization episodes. We're also going to document a gradual shift from emergency balance sheet use from war finance, that was the dominant for why central banks used their balance sheet before the 20th century, towards a more reluctant assumption of financial stability mandates, and more recently even as a monetary policy tool. Regarding what I mentioned, our causal analysis of the effects of lender of last operations in crisis times, we find indeed, and I think that's maybe a first here, large stabilizing effects. We find that central banks stepping in plausibly exogenously or like at least randomly allocated, boosting real GDP and prices, private lending, and asset prices. But, and this is a caveat, the historical record also gives us evidence for moral hazard. So the moral hazard side of these liquidity operations. I'll show you evidence that after these emergency liquidity injections in times of stress, the next boom-bust episode is just around the corner. And that's not the case if central banks abstain from intervening, from giving liquidity support to the private sector in crisis times. So there's some moral hazard support on the liquidationist side. Obviously, we don't take a stance here on the overall welfare implications of that. Okay, so let's go into detail. Annual balance sheet data on the size and the composition, as well as government debt and GDP data. We include 9 early central banks: the Bank of Naples, the Royal Bank of Prussia, Bank of San Fernando, Bank of Hamburg, Riksbank, etc. Because in a way, because we have the data, and we're kind of little nerdy economic historians here, financial historians. If you want to start with the Riksbank and the Bank of England as sort of this the modern central banks, that all our results are, all our findings are not really touched by that. And then there is a contribution that we think is central, and that speaks to our identification strategy. Namely, we're going to go to primary and secondary historical sources, and we're going to classify central bank governors that were in charge during financial crisis episodes. And we're going to categorize them into either being hawks or doves. And hawks are the guys, the guys who worry a lot about moral hazard, who are very reticent to intervene, who say, well, the financial sector is taking these risks, you should stand in for those risks. These are, these would be your Bundesbank types, emphasizing liability and responsibility and the dangers of undercutting that market discipline. And then there are going to be doves who worry about, you hold the whole economy and society hostage for what some bankers did in terms of excessive risk taking, and who are more likely to worry about the inflation, and employment, and the real economic consequences of this. Importantly, we do this ex ante on the basis of their prior to the crisis, on the basis of their ex ante beliefs, and I'll hopefully convince you that this is an interesting, good exercise, and we're going to use that information to argue that this correlates with the likelihood of interventions. I'm going to trace the effects, but I'll get to that. All this will be available on our usual JST database, which already has plenty of economic and financial data over the long run. Okay, data coverage. These are our countries. There's two informations here. One is when do we get when do central banks enter our sample? And you also see all these red dots. These red dots are expansion events that are defined here as 15% year-on-year total nominal asset growth or more, which is the threshold we use. We also do it with 20%, 25%. These events look relatively similar, but I'll get to that in a second. Let's look at some long-run trends, and then come to the economic analysis in greater detail. So this is central bank total assets over GDP for all of these countries. You have a mean, a median, and sort of interquartile range. Very clear message. If you look at the right-hand side of this chart, we are in terms of size of central bank balance sheets relative to the size of the real economy, we are in uncharted territory. We have surpassed both the sort of late 18th century wartime and also like the First and Second World War involvement of central banks with the economy. If we look at the central bank share, the share of public debt held by central banks, but the pictures are slightly different. You see here that although central banks have, hold about 20 or 30% of, or roughly 20% now at the mean of government debt, there have been times before in history, including in sort of the wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, and also early in the 20th century, when these ratios have been as high or even significantly higher. So in terms of, that's what I said at the beginning, in terms of debt monetization, we're not an unprecedented territory. You could even argue that we are quite away from these earlier levels of sort of fiscal monetary entanglements, if you want to call them that. Central bank government debt as a share of central bank assets. Sorry, that slide title is a little confusing. So, what share of central bank assets is made up of government debt? We are here roughly 40–50%. We are at levels that we've seen before in history. There's a notion here again that where we are now is not unprecedented, but we're clearly back to levels that usually are associated with wartime emergency support. That brings me to the last and maybe most interesting question. I think I've discussed this with some of you before, and there's a chart that came out of our 2014 Sintra paper with Neil and Andreas, and that we've updated now, and that just looks equally striking. It's this one. This is the size of the balance sheet of central banks relative to the size of the financial sector. And it is here that you effectively see the product of two trends. Yes, central bank balance sheets have grown relative to GDP, but the financial sector has grown much, much more relative to GDP than central bank balance sheets. So if you will, on the eve of the 2008 crisis, central bank balance sheet, if you see them as a backstop for the private sector, have never been smaller in modern history than they've been in 2008. So we've seen like very strong private sector growth in the financial intermediation sector of assets and liabilities in the financial sector. And relative to that, before 2008, the size of central banks was actually quite historically low. So what this means is it really the denominator here is really a crucial question. Yes, if you look at central bank balance sheets relative to GDP, things look quite unsettling. If you realize that the financial sector has grown so strongly relative to GDP and the central banks are backstopping effectively that large financial sector, you might come to very different conclusions, namely that these balance sheets are, this recent expansion is basically just catching up with the size of the sector that the central banks backstop. But that brings me to the point of going from long-run trends to these expansion types, these backstopping events. So now we really take an active perspective. And here you see balance sheet expansions over time, and we classify them by expansions due to financial crises. These are the blue bars, expansion due to wars. These are the red ones. And then, I mean, COVID was just around the corner when we started working on this paper. Also expansions due to natural disasters. There's the earthquake, and there's Naples earthquakes, and there's COVID. You could also put them in the financial crisis camp. But what you see clearly here is that the red over time, First World War, Second World War being the exception, gives way to expansions that are these days driven mostly by financial stability concerns. And that growing sensitivity to financial crises can also be seen here in these two charts. On the top, the average effect of central bank expansion probability by wars. You see that's relatively high, growing into the world wars. In the post-World War II phase is the probability of seeing a central bank balance sheet expansion in response to financial crisis has never been higher than in the post-World War II period. Mind you, we had crises before. Central banks were much more sort of, this is what this chart shows you, much less likely to engage in balance sheet operations. Now it's basically the standard policy response to this. So, slide cut here. Central bank balance sheet, the balance sheet tool these days is predominantly a financial stability tool. It's a lender of last resort, liquidity support tool in times of crises. What do we know about the effects of that very important role that central banks have assumed? By the way, the idea that this is only 2008 that central banks discovered balance sheet usage to safeguard financial stability obviously is not true. They've done this all over history, so that's a little bit of a short-term narrative. But still, we don't know a lot, especially using short-run data. We will never learn a lot about the effects of these interventions simply because our sample sizes are small and the identification, we just have one 2008 big crisis and everything can't be. We don't have variation or exogenous variation in balance sheet usage, and this is what this next exercise that we come to brings. This is shifting motivation. I mentioned this, precedents to we go to financial stability as the primary driver of balance sheet expansions, and we had precedents. Anyway, so testing budget. What happens? What are the effects of liquidity support during financial crisis? So what happens? What are the economic and financial causal effects of emergency interventions, lender of last resort type of interventions? It's an old debate. There is the old debate between the courage to act versus the urge to purge. It predates Badgett. It's already and the Danish Nationalbank already has a similar situation in 1857. But I think it's clear that that's the argument we make, and I'm convinced that this is true, that over time you get a relatively stable sort of front line here, if you will, between those in the central banks, but also in the economics profession and in the media more broadly, who would sympathize with Andrew Mellon's famous liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, it will purge the rottenness out of the system. People who are worried about the financial excess, the excessive risk-taking, and in response to that say, well, this is you took these risks, you stand in for that, and if you can't stand in for them, then I will have to liquidate these assets. And the undertones, of course, this will eventually take that speculation, that bubbly mentality out of the system and make the financial system more stable in the long run, because it won't happen again as quickly. There's the other side, there's the doves who say, well, yeah, there's moral hazard, but there's also the stabilization function, and we can't hold the economy hostage for what a few crazy people on Wall Street or wherever do. So it's our role as central banks actually to come in and stabilize the system, and it's what central banks were partly made for. So what we're going to do is we're going to code all governors that were in charge during crises according to their pre-existing beliefs on a three-way scale. We're going to say they're hawks. They're the people who really have a strong moral hazard, bias, are worried about asset bubbles and want to teach finance a lesson. And they're the doves who oh God, we can't hold the economy hostage. And there are pragmatists in the middle that I'll tell you what we do with them. But there's a good bunch of people who are career bureaucrats who have no strong ideological stance there. But we're also going to code those. Then we're going to ask: do these pre-existing beliefs, whether beliefs with respect to moral hazard, to the stabilization role, to the support for the wider economy, do those correlate with the balance sheet expansion probability once the crisis is there? So imagine you have a governor who is a super hawk. He's in charge. We would assume he comes in, the mechanisms by which the governor comes in charge is exogenous, then comes a crisis. Crisis is by definition unexpected. And now having a hawk in charge or a dove in charge will correlate with the expansion probability for the central bank. So do you intervene? Do you assume the lender of last resort role? This is the first stage, so to say, for our analysis. We test that. Is that true? And it's going to be true. Hawks are about 30 to 40% less likely to use the balance sheet tool. And then we're going to use that in the second stage to estimate the economic effects. So it's going to be the strategy. And I'm looking at time, so 3 minutes. So let me speed up a little bit. How do we categorize hawks and doves? Well, we have plenty of historical evidence, narrative sources, primary and secondary. Mind you, Mike Bordeaux and Cortha have a paper where they look at do people get sort of freshwater or saltwater education. That's not sufficient for us. We really want to capture biographies, policy speeches, etc. So what the key characteristics really, I'm going to be quick on this. The hawks were about moral hazard and asset prices. The doves were about full employment and the economic consequences. Pragmatists are somewhere in the middle. Here are examples. A dove, Banque de France, I hope Eric will tell us a little bit more. Maybe he doesn't agree with us. A hawk would be Bank of Canada, he's in a shirk duty, determined to curb monetary growth, very worried about the moral hazard implications, etc. So we classify all of these guys, come up with this big list. And from here on, so hawks are the red ones, the pragmatists, or the doves are the green ones. And from here on, it's kind of smooth sailing. If you accept this is a valuable exercise, and these beliefs sort of pre-existing beliefs are essentially exogenous to the crisis, the crisis probabilities and the occurrence of financial crises. Then from here on, it's kind of smooth sailing in terms of the econometric analysis. Question: do being a hawk or a dove correlate with the crisis response? So This is the share of central banks that do balance sheet interventions, and you can see that's for the hawks, that's significantly less the case. So conditional being in a crisis, do you give liquidity support and grow your balance sheet by, I think, at least 15% over that period? Big difference between doves and hawks. Correlates also a little bit with real outcomes, but let me give you this in a second and skip this. This is the first stage. So probability of intervening, of giving liquidity support to the financial sector, depending on whether the governor holds hawkish beliefs, and you see this here, hawks are 36% less likely to do that. That's our first stage. We're going to use that in the second stage. I'm going to estimate the effects of these balance sheet interventions using that first stage variation from the pre-existing beliefs. Then we're going to, in the second stage, look at economic outcomes and financial outcomes, instrument the balance sheet expansion with the beliefs, and we're going to control for all kinds of things, country fixed effects, etc. The key outcome is, I'm going to be quick on this, key outcome here are these local projections, where these large differences in terms of real GDP, CPI, but also monetary growth, obviously, because that's part of the balance sheet expansion, show up between hawks and doves. And if you believe our identification strategy, these are causal effects, or at least they point in that direction. And talk about biases. I look forward to Eric's discussion in that respect anyways. Let me finish on one last point. It's my last 20 seconds here. Also differences in investment and stock prices. Bunch of robustness checks. What about the moral hazard implications of this? And I leave you with this chart. On the left-hand side, you see conditional on having had a crisis, and the central bank did not give liquidity support. How does, over the next 20 years, the distribution of credit booms and boom-bust episodes look like? And you can see this basically, there's not much. The share of boom-bust episodes in overall credit booms is not elevated. Things look pretty like normal. Booms happen, there's boom-bust episodes, but there's no particularly increase. On the right-hand side, you see the same distribution of credit booms and boom-bust episodes after crises with liquidity injections. And I mean, I leave you with that graphic impression. First of all, there are much more credit booms that occur after these liquidity injections, and a significantly larger share of those will be bad booms, will be boom-bust episodes that end in another financial crisis. So there's some potential moral hazard channel here that we find. Liquidity support stabilizes in the short run, is successful, but potentially at the cost of increasing moral hazard in the medium term. And that's it. This is significant. You can see this all in the paper. I told you this, and I stop here and look forward to Eric's discussion.